You are listening to the Animalia Hour on KGVM. We are a podcast based in Bozeman, Montana, committed to environmentalism, human health, and redefining our relationship to other animals. We hope through this podcast to inspire you to live vegan for the same reasons. I'm Kevin.
I'm Lucy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. Welcome to our show today. We're going to launch into a new term. I don't know how many of you have heard this term before or not. It's kind of a new term to me. It's called speciesism. Speciesism. So I'm sure we've all heard of racism, classism, ageism,
Many of those.
many other.
Isms.
Right. So speciesism is a term that was coined in the 1970s by a man named Richard B. Ryder. He was an intellectual in Oxford, and he belonged to a group called the Oxford Group. And he came up with this term. The Oxford Dictionary defines speciesism as the assumption of human superiority leading to the exploitation of animals. So that's a very concise, simple definition that basically we've held throughout, more or less, I think that's been the majority view throughout human history, that humans are superior and human life has value and animal life does not. So I think that's speciesism in a nutshell.
Yeah.
A slightly more descriptive definition of speciesism is the human-held belief that all other animal species are inferior. Speciesist thinking involves considering animals who have their own desires, needs, and complex lives as means to human ends. This supremacist line of reasoning is used to defend treating other living, feeling beings as property, objects, ingredients. It's a bias rooted in denying others their own agency, interests, and self-worth, often for personal gain. And it goes on from there. But what I like about that is the idea that we use a whole slew, and we'll be kind of looking at these in our show today, but throughout human history, people have been able to come up with a lot of different justifications for being speciesist, basically. We'll talk about, like, in the Christian period, the idea that animals don't have souls, therefore we don't have any moral obligation to them. Or lots of times people say, well, we are so superior intellectually, right? We're so much more intelligent. The Homo sapiens are so far superior intellectually that that justifies that we can do whatever we want to animals, right? So there's that argument. You hear people say things like, animals don't have language, right? Only humans have language, and that's one of the things. That's the thing that separates us from animals. We have language. Animals can't communicate. It's kind of the status quo view out there. Or animals can't create. Only humans can create, right? So we tend to oversimplify the reality of the animal kingdom, all the varieties and all the abilities and all the amazing intricacies of each creature. And we tend to kind of overinflate sometimes how wonderful humans are. So we kind of turn it into this intelligence versus stupidity, or, the ability to communicate versus, silence.
Right.
So.
Correct. And obviously we know there are other views, right, too, and we can get into those. Some people say animals, I think Descartes made the distinction, we'll get into it, that animals don't have souls and humans do. And The other one is that animals don't feel pain. And part of that is tied to this intellectual argument that they don't have consciousness and therefore they don't feel. And there were just arguments along those lines, even in terms of the intellectual aspects. Anyway.
So yeah, we share this planet with non-human animals, but we've so pushed them to the periphery of our awareness that I think part of the goal of this show, of this episode, is to call some of this into question. Maybe cause us to start to rethink how we view humans and animals.
Also, when we talk about speciesism, it's we're not only necessarily talking about humans versus other non-human animals. We're also talking about speciesism in regards to, like, we treat dogs and cats a certain way, and we treat pigs and cows, etc., another way because of these different species. And not necessarily because of the characteristics that they share or don't share, but because they are part of these specific species, and that we have different laws different laws or different rules that we follow basically for them. Feel different.
Many of them cultural, right? Because there are places where people eat dogs, but in America we don't eat dogs, and so that's just one example.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Lucy. Like, I was thinking about this as we were preparing for this show. You know, if we walked outside just now and saw someone stab their dog in the throat with a knife, you know, I think the majority of people seeing that would be horrified, would want justice to be done, would call law enforcement to do something about it. And there are actual laws on our books protecting pets.
Right.
You know, that person would have to face repercussions. There would be consequences for that person for animal abuse. But, you know, not only do the majority of people, I guess, think it's fine to stab a knife in the throat of a pig or a cow or a chicken, we actually pay to have that done on a daily basis. So yeah, these are just some things to start thinking about as we enter into this conversation about speciesism. And I'd kind of like to go ahead and give a quote. So Jeremy Bentham, back in 1780, wrote his Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. And I'd like to just start with a quote from him. He said, "The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" And I really love that because it just cuts through so many of through the centuries, like I said, we've come up with so many excuses, justifications for why it's fine for us to do whatever we want to animals with impunity. In fact, you know, and we say that we're justified even in the eyes of God to treat animals however we want. But so what? Even if you could prove that certain animals don't reason, or even if you could prove that they don't communicate, what about the fact that they can suffer? And that kind of brings it back to the human responsibility. It's not about animals proving their worth to us. Are we the kind of species that is fine with the idea of inflicting suffering on another creature, another being?
Right.
So,
well, especially since we're constantly among each other, we're constantly talking about peace and nonviolence, nonviolent protests. People are protesting wars, and yet they're going and they're eating animals. So how consistent are you? It's about consistency and a holistic view of the world.
Yeah, I love that. I love that because, you know, even the idea, one of the ideas that comes up over and over again in the literature is, well, it's the natural order of things. And you hear people say this even today. Well, you know what? Like, animals prey on each other. They're really cruel to each other. There's all kinds of examples of that in nature. Therefore, why can't we? You know, how could it be wrong for us to kill them and eat them? That's just the way of the world, you know?
Right.
Like that's something that comes up a lot in the arguments as well. It's like, okay, so with that kind of logic, you know, like I guess we should still have slavery, and I guess we should still have, you know, all kinds of horrible things that we've done throughout history, because yeah, if might makes right, and that's the only standard, then like why have we outlawed so many things, you know?
Right, and that also plays into the whole lack of consistency. I mean, like Steven Pinker wrote a book, Better Angels of Our Nature, right? That Lincoln quote, and we keep hearing that recently in the last few years, like, you know, that human civilization is getting safer and better, and we're improving. There's less violence. There's less, you know, violent crime. There's all these things, and so on one side of our mouth, we're talking about the better angels of our nature and how, as a civilization, we're getting more kind and more nonviolent, and at the same time, we're continuing to eat animals, but then make arguments that, hey, the wild kingdom, there's a lot of predation, so why not just keep going down that path?
Not only that, we actually farm more animals. Like it actually
Absolutely.
climbs up in numbers.
It's increased.
Because we ignore that, yeah.
Right, exactly.
And it's also not only about like what is nature doing, but what do we want? Like what kind of world do we want to live in, and why is nature the thing we want to follow necessarily? Like why is it the voice of reason? Like if nature is the voice of reason, we don't have medicine. We allow rape to happen. We like all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it's appeal to nature is a very, very natural thing in our culture, especially to go to, and it's very understandable because it's just everywhere, right? It's a very instinctual thing to go to, but then when you think about it, it kind of makes no sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I know when you first hear the word speciesism, you know, may cause some of our listeners to kind of roll their eyes. But I would love, you know, to encourage our listeners just maybe to just be open for the next few minutes of our show, and you know, at least allow yourself to ask some of these questions. You know, it's a deeply held cultural value that we are superior to animals, and they're here for us to use and to eat and everything else. And, you know, Peter Singer, in his book, Animal Liberation, he says, when an attitude is so deeply ingrained in our thought that we take it as an unquestioned truth, a serious and consistent challenge to that attitude runs the risk of ridicule. It seems like that's kind of the knee-jerk reaction of something that comes up against our culture, is just to ridicule it. But yeah, I think these are maybe important questions, and if they resonate for you, I just encourage you to be open to thinking through some of these questions with us.
So we're gonna today we're gonna go through an overview, a very non-exhaustive overview of the history of how the Western culture views animals, and we have to mention also that when in the past they used the term vegetarian, they often meant vegan in terms of diet, especially because they just used way less like milk, honey, and eggs, etc. It was, you know. So
yeah, and the term vegan actually didn't get coined until like 1940.
Yeah.
So yeah.
44, yeah.
Yeah, so vegetarian was basically a vegan or a vegetarian prior to that.
So we'll go ahead and like Lucy said, this is definitely going to be a non-exhaustive historical overview, but I think it's still valuable to look at a little bit of history on this subject, kind of know where we came from and how people have thought about animals. We're going to go ahead and begin kind of with ancient times, the pre-Christian era, probably starting with the Hebrews and then moving into the Greek thinkers. So the Hebrew creation account obviously very ancient, and it still holds a lot of sway, since a lot of the Western world is based on Judeo-Christian beliefs. So it's a good place to start, I think. And a lot of people, myself included, I grew up in the church. When they think about the creation account, we definitely, there's a couple of things that are always emphasized to the young Christian or to any Christian when they go to church and they talk about the creation account is, number one, humans are made in the image of God, right? So that always comes up as significant, and that God gave humans dominion over creation. So those two things are definitely well known from the Hebrew creation account, and they kind of have become the justifications throughout centuries for exactly what we're talking about, speciesism, that humans matter and animals don't. Some of the things that are kind of glossed over, though, in that Hebrew creation account is the fact that in the first chapter of Genesis, God commands the animals as well as the humans to eat plants. So he says, I have created all of these seed-bearing plants for you to eat. That this is what is for you for food. So he, in the innocence of the garden that God set up, there is no predation, there's no death, nothing is being killed for food. And that's something, growing up in the church, I never heard anyone focus on that. Mm. Another thing that is kind of glossed over is what exactly did God mean when God gave humans dominion? So a more faithful reading of that, instead of just saying, oh, we're in charge, everything is here for us to use however we want, right? That's kind of the traditional reading. Actually, to look at it as, God had dominion, God established dominion over God's creation, and then handed over dominion to us to continue having dominion the way he modeled.
Right, the way he set it up.
Which was, very kind and compassionate. Like he gave everybody exactly what they needed to thrive.
Yeah, and I think the view is also that humans were to continue the creation, which was establishing order. And at the same time, there's much debate about what the image of God means, but some say, that was a very monarchical background, and with that in mind, God set them up in their image to be viceroys, to be representatives of God, and to maintain God's established order in creation, to do it the way God intended.
Right. So thinking about creatures as unique and deserving their own dignity and deserving their own agency, creatures being cared for, being given everything they need to thrive. Like that's a very different view of dominion than I think we've historically held.
Right. And I think we can get into it, maybe not here, maybe some other show, but I think you mentioned it, like there's the reading in the text of what the text says, and then there's the traditional Jewish and or Christian views that might vary from the text. And so as we'll get into some of the ways that the views have changed, but if you get to the original Hebrew, you might find that dominion and image of God don't mean what Christianity says it means today.
And as you move through the Old Testament, beyond even the creation account, there are several passages in the Old Testament that do indicate that God does care about animals. It wasn't until after the Great Flood that God finally gave permission to humans to eat animals. So it definitely wasn't part of his original plan. but it was one of the concessions that God
A
made
concession, a compromise,
later.
for sure.
That when God was bringing his people out of captivity and he gave them the 10 commandments, the commandment for the Sabbath, not only did God say, I want you to have one day where you don't have to produce, you don't have to be defined by your labor, you don't have to, acquire stuff. I want you to have one day of rest. And he said, not only do I want you to have one day of rest, but also your slaves and your servants. I want you to give them a day where they don't have to be defined by their labor. And he went further. He said, not only your slaves and your servants, I also want you to give a day of rest to your animals. So there again, it kind of flies in the face of this anthropocentric theology that we've tended to have,
Right.
to say that actually God does care about being gentle and caring for and having compassion on animals.
Well, and I think there's one thing I just want to point out. As you mentioned, the Israelites or the Hebrews were slaves under Egypt. And in the Egypt creation account, their God said that they could eat plants and animals for food. And so the Hebrews would have been aware of that because they were enslaved for so long. And we know that Moses traditionally is considered to be the author of the first 5 books, including Genesis, the Pentateuch. And so point being is that he would have been aware of the Egyptian creation account, and yet he didn't write that when he wrote or authored Genesis. So, and again, there's debate over who wrote what and this and that. But anyway, just wanted to point that out, that the Hebrews would have been aware of the Egyptian account that said they could eat animals, and they didn't include that in their creation account.
Moving forward through Hebrew scriptures, you get to the prophets, and one of the major prophets is Isaiah. And Isaiah has a passage where he is talking about God's final plan for humanity. The prophet Isaiah condemned animal sacrifices, and he has this passage where he talks about in the future when the wolf will dwell with the lamb, the lion will eat straw like an ox, and they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. So these are just some examples in the Hebrew scriptures of hints that actually, this paradigm of human superiority and basically speciesism is not God's vision.
All right, and we know that we're talking a lot about the Judeo-Christian scriptures at the moment, but that's part of this history. So we just want to mention that plays into a lot of the thinking of many people in the Western culture today still. So after, getting into and by the way, Peter Singer, he breaks this history into 3 segments, basically pre-Christian, Christian, and then Enlightenment, and then we get into the modern day. But in the ancient and or pre-Christian, it starts the account starts with the Hebrew scriptures, and then it moves into some of the Greeks like Pythagoras and Aristotle. So,
yeah, and I mean, when we talk about the great Greek thinkers, one thing to keep in mind is they were divided into rival schools, so their thinking is definitely not uniform by any means. So you have a lot of varying ideas about animals during the ancient Greek tradition. But, one bright light from our perspective is Pythagoras. He was a vegetarian, and he encouraged his followers to treat animals with respect. So unfortunately, though, I guess, there was also Aristotle who had very different views.
right.
When it came to people, humans as well as animals. I mean, he felt like some people are just born to be slaves.
Right. And to serve man, and he established a hierarchy. And I think the and this is where we get the whole intellectual powers, like basically free men were the most rational people, and then human slaves were less rational. And then underneath that, he didn't comment much on it, but the implication is that animals were less than human and therefore did not have intellectual capabilities. And so they were meant to be.
Oh, he said that. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. He did. At the same time,
Yeah.
you know, they were basically left to be used by man as devices, as instruments.
Right. He wrote, or he said, plants exist for the sake of animals, brute beasts for the sake of man.
Right.
Domestic animals for his use and food, wild ones for food. So, you know, and yeah, obviously we wish that maybe Pythagoras' thought took a deeper hold on the imagination of people at that time. But I think that as we'll watch, you know, as we transition from the ancient times into, you know, the Christian era, we'll see that Aristotle's thought definitely influenced the people who came after him.
Right. And it's mostly Thomas Aquinas. He held sway for, I would say, many centuries. And he was highly influenced by Aristotle. And so he pretty much repeats what Aristotle was saying, that, you know, there's a hierarchy of rationalism, intellectual humans, and then animals, brutes, were meant to be, I want to say slaves, but like just instruments of man. And
also something that's interesting to look at is I remember reading about how Thomas Aquinas actually he was interested in the welfare of animals, especially the animals of labor, not because it's important to have compassion to them because they can suffer, etc., but because by practicing compassion towards these animals, you are practicing compassion to humans, which is the only one that matters to him. And so that's a view that was very, I think, pretty pervasive in this time as well because of
Right. And it what it does is it maintains that anthropocentric view that humans are the pinnacle of creation and or evolution, however you want to look at it. And even though we didn't get to the origin of species until later, but man was the pinnacle of all, and everything was meant to serve man. So this is what Thomas Aquinas maintains. And, you know, we've mentioned, there are exceptions throughout the history of Western civilization. There are people like Pythagoras or even St. Francis of Assisi. And if you know anything about St. Francis, he seemed to consider humans and animals, I think he considered animals as friends, but he also considered rocks and trees to be almost of equal, all matter to be of almost equal weight. At the same time, he also didn't refrain from eating animals. So,
which makes sense if you consider rocks as equal to animals.
True,
you know?
I suppose. Yes.
So yeah, we're kind of transitioning into like the Christian era, and that kind of happened. Not kind of, it happened under the Roman Empire. So Christianity came along and really united Jewish and Greek ideas about animals. And I'd like to just spend a second on Christianity's influence on the Roman Empire, specifically when it comes to what was known as the Roman Games. And I'm sure our listeners have at least heard about the Colosseum Games that the Romans would hold for entertainment for their citizens. And they did this. The idea was that it would toughen up their citizens. So through observing violence and, I guess, murder, their citizens would become stronger, you know. So not only did it just, you know, I think it started out as just fights to the death between two gladiators. But here's a quote from a historian named W.E.H. Lecky. He says, the simple combat became at last insipid, and every variety of atrocity was devised to stimulate the flagging interest. At one time, a bear and a bull, chained together, rolled in fierce combat across the sand. At another, criminals dressed in skins of wild beasts were thrown to bulls, which were maddened by red-hot irons, or by darts tipped with burning pitch. 400 bears were killed on a single day under Caligula. Under Nero, 400 tigers fought with bulls and elephants. In a single day at the dedication of the Colosseum by Titus, 5,000 animals perished. Under Trajan, the games continued for 123 consecutive days. Lions, tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotami, giraffes, bulls, stags, even crocodiles and serpents were employed to give novelty to the spectacle. Nor was any form of human suffering wanting. 10,000 men fought during the games of Trajan. Nero illumined his gardens during the night by Christians burning in their pitchy shirts. Under Domitian, an army of feeble dwarves was compelled to fight. So intense was the craving for blood that a prince was less unpopular if he neglected the distribution of corn than if he neglected the games.
Wow.
So Christianity comes along and for the first time really starts protesting, basically, these games under the Christian idea that was pretty revolutionary at the time, that all human beings have value, that there's sanctity to human life. And this, revolutionized the culture. And basically, the games went on, unfortunately, for animals, but no longer did they include humans fighting to the death. So I think that's really interesting for a few different reasons. It shows how, the Romans at the time were one of the most civilized nations on the planet. And they certainly, were able to show kindness to each other. But it's so interesting to me that they were able to kind of cut their conscience in half. Again, just kind of like how we opened our show, the idea that we care about certain animals, but not others. And there's really no scientific, intellectual defense for that. We know that pigs are every bit as intelligent as dogs, and you could say a lot of things about that. But we're able to cut our feelings of sympathy and compassion and care kind of in half, and we could be very caring people, but still have no feeling in another arena like this.
That reminds me a lot about animal sacrifice. In ancient times in the West, it was really, it's very, very common. Like the slaughterhouse was the temple. That's literally what it was. And there were different figures that were already opposed to that. And it obviously went away in those times after ancient times. But it just reminds me of that because obviously these people were ingrained with the thought that animal sacrifice is just a normal part of their culture, right?
Right.
So stopping the games, for example, it's much harder because there wasn't human sacrifice, right? It wasn't a thing in Western culture. So to me, it makes sense in that way that it was harder for them to conceptualize of stopping animal sacrifice, because it is animal sacrifice, really, these games. It is human sacrifice when it was the humans as well.
And there were a few Romans during this time that we know showed compassion for suffering for humans as well as animals, and a repulsion for the use of sentient creatures for human pleasure. Four that we'd like to at least call out to is Ovid, Seneca, Porphyry, and Plutarch, who all advocated strongly for the kind treatment of animals.
Porphyry wrote a book called On Abstinence from Beings with a Soul, and he was vegetarian himself. And in this book, someone said to him this: "If, however, someone should think it is unjust to destroy brutes, such a one should neither use milk, nor wool, nor sheep, nor honey. For as you injure a man by taking from him his garments, Thus also you injure a sheep by sharing it. Milk likewise was not produced by you, but for the young of the animal that has it. The bee also collects honey as food for itself, which you, by taking away, administer to your own pleasure. So basically, this person in the book was telling Porphyry that to not be a hypocrite, he should be vegan, which is pretty funny. Either it was an actual vegan back then, or probably just someone who was seeing the inconsistency there, which is pretty interesting in an ancient text, right? I mean, it's pretty old.
Yeah. So in this whirlwind history class, we're going to jump ahead all the way to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is when we get, humanism. And maybe as no surprise, this is a period of time where humankind was really being celebrated. Some of the thoughts of the time, things you'll hear or read about during the Renaissance was, man is the measure of all things, as well as nothing in the world can be found that is more worthy of admiration than man. So there was definitely an elevation of humans during the Renaissance, which once again didn't really bode well for how animals were being treated. There, of course, as always, there are some shining examples of people who were resisting that, including Leonardo da Vinci. He was teased by his friends for being so concerned about the sufferings of animals that he became a vegetarian. There was another person named, less well-known, I think, Giordano Bruno, who he was actually burned at the stake just for saying that, man is not the center of the universe and that other creatures deserve consideration as well.
That's crazy.
So, but the Renaissance also produced people like René Descartes. And Descartes did a lot of work in this area of study, and he ended up just basically, once again, saying that only humans have souls, and so therefore he kind of came up with a whole bunch of unfortunate beliefs about animals, and he ended up just considering them mere machines. Automata, is that?
Automata, or automata.
Say it again. Automata.
I meant it for different things. Automata. Yeah. I mean.
So he basically said that animals do not feel pain. They are just machines. He compared them to a clock. He said, yeah, of course they're more complex than a clock because people made clocks and God made animals. So of course they're more complex, but when they squeal, when you cut them with a knife, it's just the way like a clock spring would make a noise if you hit the spring. And so, yeah, he really tried to let himself and everybody around him off the hook, that really there was no need to feel guilty or have any conscience about it.
And what were they doing? They were actually dissecting animals to learn about human anatomy. And so, but there were people that were doing this, and he had to go around and almost like, give him pep talks, right? It sounded like.
Vivisection or dissection?
Vivisection.
Yeah.
Vivisection. So, for people who aren't quite clear on that, that just means dissecting or cutting open animals while they're alive. While they're alive. And there was no anesthesia at this time, so there was absolutely no painkiller given at all. So. There's accounts of him and his students beating dogs and nailing them to boards, cutting them open to study the circulatory system. And if any of his students had an ethical problem or got upset by this, they were made fun of and were told, you're so stupid, these animals can't feel pain.
Right. Right. It's so sad. But the leading idea we get from Descartes is this concept of the soul, and he makes a demarcation between animals and humans, that humans have souls and animals don't. And with that whole concept of the soul, he incorporates all of these things, this lack of feeling, this lack of rational consciousness, this lack of, and therefore not worthy of any ethical considerations because they weren't conscious feeling beings. So
just machines, basically.
yeah, machines. Yeah, like you said, like clocks. And then, thankfully we eventually get into the Enlightenment. And
Just want to mention how it sounds to me. Like, I remember learning about Descartes in school and thinking, that sounds a lot like sociopathy to me.
yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
What was acceptable?
It was the time in human history where science was really taking off. And, so to pacify yourself that, this being can't feel pain and has no soul and is just a machine, is probably necessary to think that way. If you're so hungry for scientific knowledge that, you want to learn about anatomy and you want to cut them open and see how things are actually functioning. And so I think it was a convenient justification, which, we do the same thing today, honestly. So yeah, we move into the Enlightenment, which I guess Descartes kind of ushered in.
Right.
There.
All right. And it's worth noting that Thomas Aquinas, the major ethical claim that Aquinas makes is his acceptance of the Aristotelian view that the imperfect exists for the more perfect, and that we humans are, of course, the most perfect of all. Hence, we are entitled to kill to sustain our lives, but animals, not so much. They're savage beasts. So it's interesting that Thomas Aquinas, his views, he was like a dominant view in this period, in the medieval period, almost 400 years, and things didn't really change until really we get into the Enlightenment, and it almost seems like things got worse in Renaissance humanism with Descartes, because from Aquinas we get Aquinas, and with the Aristotelian views, they just didn't even consider animals. They weren't even a part of their ethical program. It kind of ended with humans, and less rational humans were slaves. They were worse than regular humans. But when it gets to Descartes, he even then brings us the idea of the soul, and that animals don't have souls, and therefore they're not rational and they can't feel, and all these horrible things with vivisection. But then things start to turn for animals when we get to the Enlightenment. And so we have people like Rousseau and Voltaire and Jeremy Bentham, and we start to get some ethical considerations for animals in this period.
And I think some people would say that was a result of the fact that in the Enlightenment, people were starting to, maybe for the first time in history, openly question what the church was teaching and try to start to throw off some of the institutional doctrines. And so I think people were trying to look at it through fresh eyes. And so that, like you mentioned, Jeremy Bentham's quote, maybe we shouldn't be talking about can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer?
Can they suffer?
So
right.
One interesting, exciting thing, I think that's a win for the animals that happened in the 1800s, happened in the UK. In 1821, there was a man named Richard Martin, who was an Irish gentleman landowner and a member of the Parliament for Galway. He proposed a law to prevent the ill treatment of horses. And the account is that as soon as he proposed this, all of Parliament erupted in laughter to the point where nobody could hear what anybody was saying, because ridicule, right?
Right.
The fact that you're saying that we should even stop to, this is Parliament. Why are we talking about horses and their lives and how we're treating them? The bill failed. I think he proposed a few bills, but the following year, he was successful in getting a bill passed. The bill made it an offense to wantonly mistreat certain domestic animals, the property of any other person or persons. So for the first time in human history, cruelty to animals was a punishable offense. Of course, this left out most animals, but it is significant that for the first time, people thought, hey, maybe they deserve some legal protection.
Right. It was the first law, right?
Well, yeah, it reminds me actually, there were pharaohs, for example, and other leaders in ancient times actually and also in other parts of the world, but we're talking about the Western world right now, that were encouraging their civilians and etc. to not abuse animals because of their own philosophies and stuff, but it wasn't necessarily law. So that's the big difference. It wasn't necessarily punishable, which is really putting animals on a more equal foot, right?
Right. This says that since, of course, animals couldn't make a complaint if they were treated poorly, Richard Martin actually formed the first animal welfare organization, later to become the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
Right. And it was also around this time that Charles Darwin was working on his theory of the origin of species and the descent of man. He was working on it for over a decade. There's an interesting quote here that was in his notebooks. It says, "Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity. More humble, and I believe true, to consider him created from animals." I think that's a very interesting quote, too, because here we have for the first time an idea or a view that challenges, the traditional religious view of the day. And basically, where religion has, Christianity, specifically Judeo-Christian principles, have established man as the hierarchy, as the pinnacle of creation. Now we have Darwin coming along and establishing man. I don't want to say the pinnacle, but I think many people after him put man at the top of the food chain, the hierarchy. But in this quote from Darwin right here, it's interesting what he's saying. He's basically saying that we have come from animals and that we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for animals. That's kind of how I'm reading it a little bit. And I find it
and
very...
that we are animals.
Oh, we are animals,
we
true.
don't even put ourselves on that level.
Which was such a controversial thing for him to say at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is kind of crazy, right? Because it's obvious. Like, we are literally... Like, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you have to think about, it's kind of what you're saying. The time he was in, the cultural time and he was in, this was revolutionary. I mean, this was massively revolutionary. And yet, how was it that he... established these views and came up with these? Obviously, it was through his own observations, but my point is the fact that he, you know what I mean? There were many people that could see the same thing he was seeing, but for some reason he put it together, categorized it, and established it and put it out there. And I don't know.
And I think it's worth noting at this point, or for us to kind of discuss a little bit, that, for most of human history, at least the Western periods of history that we've discussed today, it seems like the Judeo-Christian, / Greek thinkers kind of was the foundation, the bedrock for how we view humans. And we see the results of that. We see how, animals were treated as worthless, basically, or only worth what they could give us. And then along comes more of an evolutionary understanding of our relationship to animals. And I think it's the question that comes up to my mind is, has the state of animals improved or not really? Since, evolution has become more of an accepted theory.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I know many non-religious people sometimes like to think that they're more ethical than religious people. And in this particular arena, I can't say that that the non-religious people that hold these views are any better than the religious people when it comes to the treatment of animals. They're almost the same.
Yeah, it seems like no matter which camp you land in, it seems like just the majority of people, the majority of humans on this planet kind of hold the same view when it comes to how we view non-human animals and how we can treat them.
And what does that say, though? What does that speak to? To me, that speaks to culture.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's culture informing our beliefs, not our beliefs informing our culture.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd like to also read a little bit of the end of this chapter in Singer's book as he kind of wraps up this history. It says, in the practical matter of how we act toward other animals, little has changed. If animals are no longer quite outside the moral sphere, they are still in a special section near the outer rim. Their interests are allowed to count only when they do not clash with human interests. If there is a clash, even a clash between a lifetime of suffering for a non-human animal and the gastronomic preference of a human being, the interests of the non-human are disregarded. So, I mean, that's really putting it in its starkest terms, I think, that what the idea that we're more than willing to end an animal's life, take their life away from them after giving them a life of suffering, just for a meal, just for a taste preference, just for, you know, a traditional holiday meal or whatever. Then he goes on to say, the moral attitudes of the past are too deeply embedded in our thought and our practices to be upset by a mere change in our knowledge of ourselves and of other animals. I think this goes right into what we're saying about, the knowledge that Darwin introduced to the human race was awesome and great and enlightening. But when we're coming up against something that is so embedded in our thoughts, so embedded in our practices, so embedded in our culture, sometimes just mere new knowledge isn't enough to get us to stop and change course.
Yeah, and it is interesting to me, too, when we consider everything we've been talking about. There's a part of me, as I'm listening to us discuss this, that it's like, man, why didn't anybody... And we know there were pockets of people like Pythagoras, and there were other people that might have been vegetarian along the way, but it didn't become the mainstream dominant idea. And I don't know, there's a part of me that's like, man, why didn't anybody challenge this like hundreds of years ago? And kind of what you were saying earlier, Lucy, right now we there's this whole last few years, the whole concept of we talk about the better angels of our nature. Books are being written and keep people, especially like Steven Pinker, others are keep saying, humans are getting better. We are getting more moral, more ethical. And yet in this area, we're killing more animals. There's more animal suffering today than there was hundreds of years ago. And it's getting worse. It's not getting better.
I have a theory for that.
Yeah.
It's because I feel like we're getting more powerful as well because of how we've designed our world, etc. Like it's just we're getting more powerful at getting what we want, right? And when we don't question what we want, it ends up being like this, right? And it's just we just have more power because of all our technologies and connectivity.
We've definitely become more and more sophisticated at manipulating and exploiting the animals. And however, how is it possible that we're farming and exploiting and abusing and killing more animals than ever before? Part of the piece, there's a piece of the puzzle right there that I think we need to mention, which is it's completely kept out of sight. Mm-hmm. People don't see it. People don't have to drive by it. People don't have to smell it. Most of us, we know that there are some poor communities where these places are located that are suffering because of the air pollution and the water pollution, et cetera. But these things are intentionally kept out of sight because we have, as a human species, we have evolved to where the industry knows if we were to see it and smell it and hear it, people would have a problem with it. But as long as they can keep it out of sight, out of mind, they can continue to grow and grow and grow.
Also, it's interesting when you look at all of this history. A lot of people, I would say most people, might see veganism as a modern thing, and it's like a trend, new trend, like millennial thing or something, or from the 80s. And it really actually shocked me when I started looking into the history of veganism and animal rights or whatever, how like in the West, yes, and also we haven't talked about other Eastern cultures or whatever. In other cultures in ours, there were people that actually were thinking about that and were valuing animal lives and interests. And that is comforting to vegans as well. And it's interesting because it's, most people don't necessarily know that. And
Right. Absolutely.
So to wrap up my piece of this show, I just, I'd like to appeal to the listener. I think that we can adopt more of an expansive ethic for all animals, for all of creation, that every single creature is worthy of care and compassion and love and dignity and protection from us. And I think that hopefully, my hope is that we as a species can move closer and closer to that kind of expansive morality.
And so this is like the first show in a series of shows we're going to do about animal superpowers, pretty much, their capabilities and how we view them. And you can email us at vegansofbozeman@gmail.com. And you can just give us feedback or ask us questions. We'll be very happy to answer you. And also check our Facebook page and our Animalia Hour YouTube. Type Animalia Hour with vegan to find it better. Yeah, we also have an Instagram.
Awesome. We'll catch you next time. Later.